The most important takeaway here is the cultural impact.
Mhm.
It's fascinating because we see this pattern repeating throughout history.
Rain hammered the tin roof of the farmhouse before first light. Daniel Harper stood on the back porch in his work coat, listening to the sound it made on the metal, the way it had made that sound every winter of his life. The cold came in off the mountains in long, flat waves, and the fields beyond the barn were invisible in the dark. The woman in the doorway behind him refused to meet his eyes. He had gone looking for her in the rain, driven into town, knocked on her door at 9 in the evening like a man who had run out of ways to stay still. And now here they were, back at the farm, standing in the place he knew better than any other, and she was telling him something that took courage to say. Her hands smelled faintly of dish soap. She had washed them before she got in the truck, out of habit. She said the words the way a person says something they have been carrying for years and have finally decided to put down, not dramatically, not with tears, but with the flat precision of someone who has rehearsed this particular sentence many times and always hoped they would not have to say it. I am not fit for any man. The storm moved across the valley. Daniel heard every syllable. She forced herself to continue. Her voice was steady. But I can love your children. He stood very still. He was not disappointed. He was not confused. He was doing what he did when something important happened, organizing it, finding the correct place for it inside himself. Making room, because he had heard what she was really saying, and what she was offering, if he was willing to understand it, was not less than what he had hoped for. It was simply a different shape of the same thing. The alarm went at 5:15. Daniel silenced it before the first ring finished, pulled on his jeans and flannel shirt in the dark, and went down the stairs by feel, the way he had done since his father's time, when the house was full of people and the mornings had a different character entirely. The farmhouse sat on 40 acres in a valley in western Montana, surrounded by winter wheat fields that had belonged to his family for 2 generations. He had grown up in that kitchen, learned to read weather by the quality of light over the eastern ridge, helped his father stretch wire along the creek pasture every spring. When his father died of a coronary at 68, Daniel took over without discussion because there was no one else and because the farm required it, and he had understood from a young age that some things simply require you, and it is better to accept this early. He was 26 when he took over. He was 42 now. The farm was doing fine, which in Montana farm terms meant it was surviving the debt serviceable, the equipment aging but functional, the land producing what land in that valley was capable of producing. He did not complain about this. He had never expected ease, and ease had not materialized, and the two facts lived comfortably together. He lit the stove and put on coffee and started the pancake batter. The kitchen was cold until the stove got going. He listened to it warm up the tick and settle of the old iron while the batter came together. The table had 4 chairs. 3 years ago he had pushed the 4th against the wall beside the cabinet where he kept the dish towels. He told himself it was to make more room when the kids spread their homework out after school. He had not moved it back. Lily sometimes looked at it. He had noticed this and did not acknowledge it, because there was nothing useful to say. His daughter came downstairs in her socks, dragging a stuffed rabbit by one ear. Lily was 6, and she had her mother's dark hair and her mother's way of inhabiting a room, quiet but complete, as if she had decided exactly how much space she needed and had taken precisely that amount. She climbed into her chair, arranged the rabbit on the table, and asked if they were having the blueberry kind. Plain today. We're out of blueberries. She nodded. This was acceptable. Lily was, in general, a child who accepted the facts of a situation and moved forward from them, which Daniel had come to think of as the most practical form of wisdom he had ever encountered, and the saddest. His son Ethan came down 10 minutes later, already dressed, backpack on, moving with the deliberate self-sufficiency he had been developing over the past year. He was 10, and something in him had shifted in the last several months, not toward sullenness, but toward interiority. a turning inward that Daniel recognized because he had done the same thing at that age, when he began to understand that the world was larger and more complicated than it had previously appeared, and that understanding it was going to be his own responsibility. Ethan poured his own orange juice and sat and read the back of the cereal box. He always read whatever was in front of him. He could not help it. They ate. Daniel made sure the kids had what they needed and cleared the plates and drove them to school and came back to a quiet house that was already building its list of requirements for the day. Upper pasture fence along the north field. 3 posts rotted through and needing replacement. The tractor's hydraulic line, which had been seeping since October and which he had been managing rather than fixing because managing it was free and fixing it was not. The harness on the grain auger. The window in the equipment barn that let cold air in when the latch was not fully engaged. The dog, Walt, who was 10 years old and arthritic and needed to be helped down from the porch, step in icy weather, and who looked at Daniel each morning with an expression of ancient patience. He worked through it. He always worked through it. By December of that year, he was making mistakes from accumulated tiredness, a gate left unlatched overnight. A call to the vet he had meant to make and forgotten, a calculation error in the feed order that cost him 2 days and a trip he could not afford. He recognized the mistakes. He was not a careless man. He was a tired one, which was different, and which had a different solution. And by the time he admitted this to himself, he had already lost a week to the consequences of ignoring it. The problem was structural. He was doing the work of 2 people because there was only one of him. The farm needed him, and the kids needed him, and the house needed someone. And the someone was always him. And he was one person who slept 5.5 hours a night and had not taken a full day off in 2 years. Something had to give. He just had to figure out what. His neighbor, Ruth Dalton, came by on a Tuesday in the second week of December with a ceramic pot of white bean soup and the expression she wore when she had arrived at a conclusion about someone else's life and planned to share it. Ruth was 71 and had lived on the adjacent property since before Daniel was born. She had a way of seeing exactly what was happening in a situation that Daniel had come to respect completely, even when it annoyed him. She set the soup on the counter and looked around the kitchen with the measuring gaze of someone conducting an assessment. She looked at the pile of laundry visible through the hallway door. She looked at the stack of mail on the counter that he had not gotten to. She looked at him. "There's a woman in town I'd like you to talk to," she said. He was trying to answer a school permission slip while the pasta water boiled. "I'm not looking for." "She's looking for housework," Ruth said. "That's all I'm saying. Not a romantic arrangement. Someone to keep the house running. She cooks, she does laundry, she cleans. She's been working for the Hargrove family over on Route 9, but they relocated to Bozeman in October, and she's been picking up shorter jobs since." Ruth sat down at the table, uninvited, which was her habit. "I've known her 4 years. She's reliable, and she's careful, and she doesn't make things complicated." Daniel turned the pasta down and looked at his neighbor. Ruth did not recommend people casually. She had a genuine talent for matching people to situations, a quality that had served the community around her for decades, and which she deployed without ceremony. "How old?" he asked, which was not the right question, but was the first one he thought of. 38. Lives alone. No complications. Ruth looked at him steadily. "Daniel, the kids need this house to run properly. You need to sleep more than 4 hours. Let someone help." He called the number that evening after the kids were in bed. The woman's voice was even and unhurried. She asked 2 questions. What days, what hours, and he answered them. And she said she could come Friday for a trial day if that suited him, and he said it did. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. He found this efficient quality reassuring. On Friday, the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees, and the sky was a flat, pewter gray that pressed down low over the valley. He was in the equipment barn working on the hydraulic line when he heard tires on the gravel drive. He wiped his hands and went out. The truck was a 10-year-old Dodge with road salt on the lower panels, well maintained in the ways that counted. The woman who stepped out was wearing a canvas work coat and waterproof boots and had her brown hair pulled back at the neck. She was not slight, but she was not large. She had the build of someone who did physical work regularly and had stopped thinking about it. She looked at the farmhouse first, taking it in the way a person takes in a new workspace, noting its condition and requirements. Then she looked at him. "Clara Hayes," she said. "Daniel Harper." A pause in which she looked at the barn, then back at him. "I work hard," she said. "I don't steal. I don't need to be told twice how you want things done. And I don't talk much unless there's something to say." He thought about this for a moment. "Those are exactly the requirements," he said. She nodded once, picked up her bag, and went inside. He stood in the cold a moment longer, listening to the wind move through the fence line, and then he went back to the hydraulic line. She came Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Then, because there was always more than the original arrangement had accounted for, Tuesdays and Thursdays as well. She arrived at 7:30 and left by 4 and did not vary from this unless asked, in which case she adjusted without complaint and without marking the adjustment as a favor. She brought her own coffee in a thermos dark roast, no sugar, and drank it standing at the kitchen window while she organized the day in her head. He could tell she was doing this from the quality of her stillness. It lasted perhaps 3 minutes. Then she put the thermos on the counter and started. The laundry was always folded before noon. The floors were swept daily and mopped on Wednesdays. The refrigerator was cleaned on the first Wednesday of each month. The shelves wiped down, the expired things removed, the items grouped by type so that what you needed was where you expected it to be. She had a method for everything, and the methods were good ones, developed through practice rather than theory. She had a way of reading a room that reminded him of the way a mechanic listens to an engine, not guessing, just attending, letting the thing tell you what it needed. She learned quickly what the house needed and supplied it without being asked and without calling attention to the supply. The house changed. Gradually, over the first several weeks, the quality of the air in it was different. The surfaces were clear. Things had places. The kids' backpacks had hooks by the door. The dish towels were in the second drawer rather than shoved wherever there was space. Small things. The aggregate of small things was not small. She learned, without being told, that Ethan put ketchup on his eggs and would not be caught admitting it at school. That Lily liked the crusts cut off her sandwiches but would eat them if they were set aside on a small plate rather than discarded. Because throwing food away seemed to her wrong in a way she could not articulate but felt firmly. That Walt, the border collie, needed his arthritic hip worked on in a particular way before he would lie down contentedly, a kind of sustained pressure along the joint that took about 2 minutes, and which Clara discovered by watching how he moved and applying the obvious inference. She learned that Daniel kept the kitchen radio tuned to the classical station that came in from Missoula, and that it needed to be angled toward the window to pick up clearly, and that he preferred it on in the evenings when he was doing the farm's books at the table. She did not comment on this. She simply left it on. Lily attached herself to Clara within the first week. She followed her through the house, asking questions about whatever was in front of them, the dish she was making, the pattern on the curtain, whether the birds outside were the same birds every day or different ones. Clara answered each question with the same patient attentiveness she brought to everything else. She never spoke to Lily in the slightly elevated, simplified register that adults often used with small children. She spoke to her the way she would speak to anyone, clearly and without condescension, which Lily appeared to recognize and appreciate. Ethan maintained his customary reserve. He was polite to Clara in the manner of someone who has decided that being polite is simply the correct behavior, regardless of circumstance. He did not seek her out, but Daniel noticed that Ethan's homework was consistently done in the evenings now, which had not always been the case, and that his backpack was packed the night before, rather than assembled in a panic at 7:20. He did not know which of these things was Clara's influence and which was Ethan's own momentum, and it did not seem to matter. Daniel noticed that she always set the table for 4. He had not told her about the chair by the wall. He had said nothing about it. She simply set it at the table with the others as a matter of course, and when no fourth person sat, she cleared it with the others. He wondered once whether she counted chairs or assumed a table of that size was for 4 people. He decided it was the latter. He did not ask. He told himself he was not watching her particularly. He was simply aware of her the way you are aware of any new element in a space you know very well, noting it, letting it settle. It happened on a Thursday in January, in the kind of cold that makes metal brittle and mistakes expensive. He was replacing a rotted section of fence along the east pasture, working fast because the temperature was dropping and the light would go by 3:30. The post driver slipped on a patch of ice he had not noticed. The handle came up sharply and caught his left hand between the iron weight and the top rail of the fence. He stood still for a moment. He held the hand against his coat and breathed carefully until the first wave of pain settled into something manageable, and then he started back toward the house. He was thinking, as he walked, about logistics. The kids' pickup time was 3:15. Clara's car, and whether it started reliably in this temperature, whether the wound needed stitches, or whether he could close it himself and save the clinic visit. He was organizing the situation the way he organized all situations, because organization was the only tool he trusted completely. He came through the back door into the kitchen. Clara looked up from the cutting board. She saw the hand immediately. She put the knife down and crossed the kitchen without hurrying, which he registered as the correct response, not panic. Not the performed calm that was secretly panic, but genuine, practical attention. "Let me see," she said. He showed her. The gash ran across 2 knuckles, deep and ragged, and had bled through the cloth he had pressed against it during the walk from the pasture. She ran warm water over the wound and cleaned it with methodical care, using the gauze and antiseptic from the first aid kit under the sink that she had, he now realized, reorganized some weeks ago. She worked without commentary. When she had finished the cleaning, she looked at the wound and said, "The tendon needs to be checked. You need the clinic." It was not a suggestion. "The kids, I'll stay until you're back. Go now, before it tightens up." She was already wrapping the hand firmly. He looked at her. She met his look directly, with the expression of someone who has made a decision and does not require endorsement of it. "I'll be back by 6, he said. "Fine." He drove to the clinic in town. The doctor confirmed 2 stitches and no tendon damage and told him to keep it dry and clean for a week, which was not particularly compatible with farm work in winter but was the medical advice regardless. He drove back in the early dark. The kitchen was warm and lit. He came through the door to find Lily at the table, drawing horses with the intense focus she brought to horse drawings specifically, and Ethan working through a math worksheet, and Clara at the stove finishing what turned out to be a beef and vegetable soup that he could smell from the doorway. "How many stitches?" Ethan asked, without looking up from the worksheet. 2. Dad had stitches, Lily told her rabbit, by way of explanation. On the counter, covered with a plate, was his dinner. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He had not asked for this. He had said he would be back by 6, and she had taken that as information and used it. He sat down and ate, and answered the kids' questions about the fence and the ice and the precise mechanism by which the post driver had slipped, and after dinner helped with the last of Ethan's homework and got both kids bathed and into bed. When he came back downstairs, Clara was finishing the dishes. "You didn't have to stay this late," he said. She looked at him briefly. The soup needed another hour. She said it as though that explained everything, and it did, and she handed him the covered plate from the counter and told him to eat while it was still warm. He sat at the table and ate, and she finished the dishes, and the kitchen was very quiet. He had felt loneliness before, in the years since his wife had left, a general, ambient loneliness, the kind that came from being alone too long. But sitting in the kitchen that night, with the evidence of another person's consideration all around him, he understood for the first time that the loneliness had been specific, not just the absence of company, the absence of someone who paid attention. February came in gray and heavy, the snow going wet and dense, the kind of winter that feels like it has decided to outstay its welcome. The fields were a dull expanse of gray-white, and the creek was loud with ice melt, running high along the lower pasture. The farmhouse held its warmth. The evenings after the kids went upstairs became their own kind of time, shaped by proximity and the natural human impulse toward conversation when the work of the day is done and the house is quiet. It began without intent. She would be finishing something at the end of the day, going over the grocery list, wiping down the stovetop, and he would be at the table with his coffee doing the farm's accounts, and he would say something about the weather or the price of feed or the condition of the lower pasture fence, and she would answer, and the answer would contain something that led somewhere, and they would follow it. She told him about growing up in a small town in western Nebraska, the second of 4 children, in a house where money was always in motion and never quite landed. Her grandmother had lived with them for the last 8 years of her life and had been the organizing intelligence of the household, a woman of formidable practical competence who believed that knowing how to do things correctly was a form of self-respect. She had taught Clara to cook not from recipes but from attention, watching the color of butter in a pan, listening to the sound bread made when it was ready, understanding that food was a physical system with its own logic and that the logic was learnable. She talked about these things with the same careful precision she brought to her work, and Daniel understood that she was telling him not just about her grandmother, but about how she had developed her own way of being in the world, grounded in observation, in the particular rather than the general, in what was actually there rather than what was supposed to be there. He talked about the farm, about his father, who had been a man of few words and consistent presence, who had shown Daniel everything he needed to know about the land through demonstration rather than instruction, the way you learned from watching someone do something correctly enough times that it lodged in your hands rather than just your head, about what it meant to inherit a piece of land and try to honor what had been put into it, without being crushed by the obligation of that honoring. She listened the way that certain rare people listen without preparing her response while he was still talking, without redirecting the conversation back to her own experience, simply receiving what he was saying and holding it without immediately returning it. It was a quality that had become uncommon enough that he noticed it as a quality, the way you notice good light. He did not fail to observe that she never talked about her own life in any current or direct way. The stories she told were all from before Nebraska. Her grandmother, a woman she had worked for in Billings who had been genuinely kind and had let her use the small library in the back of the house. Nothing about where she had been in the years before coming to the valley. Nothing about family she was in contact with. Nothing about friends, or what she did on the evenings and weekends when she was not at the farm. He did not push at this. He understood that a person's arrangement of their own privacy was their own business, and that pushing at it was a way of saying that your curiosity was more important than their boundary, which he had no interest in saying. He simply noted it and left it where it was. What he could not leave where it was, or at least could not stop noticing, was that he was looking forward to these evenings. He was looking forward to the specific quality of her company. Her dry observations about things, her unwillingness to fill silence with noise, the way she sometimes smiled at something he said a moment after he said it, as though she was fact-checking the joke against her own experience before allowing the response. He found this deeply pleasant and somewhat inconvenient. He also noticed that the list of things he wanted to tell her was growing small things, farm things, the kind of incidental observations that accumulate in a day and have nowhere to go if there is no one to go to. The barn cat had delivered a litter in the hay bales. The creek had cracked its ice shelf overnight, and the sound had woken him at 3. These were not important things, but they were the texture of a life, and he had been storing them up for someone without knowing he was doing it. And now he knew who the someone was, and the knowing was both simple and complicated. He stopped by Ruth's place on a Saturday in late February, ostensibly to return a casserole dish she had left at the farm weeks ago. Ruth made tea as if she had been expecting him, which perhaps she had, and they sat in her kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and the herbs she wintered on the south windowsill. He had not planned to ask about Clara. He was not sure how it came up. He said something about how the arrangement had been working out well, and Ruth looked at him with an expression that was careful and somewhat weighted. "She's had a hard time," Ruth said. She wrapped both hands around her mug. She was married. He was from a family out past Great Falls, comfortable people, the kind who have inherited opinions about what things are supposed to look like. She paused. When they found out she couldn't have children, a condition, not something that would have been obvious before the marriage, his family made their view quite clear. His mother, especially. Another pause. Longer. The word they used was not fit. Not a real woman, some of them said. His sisters. Outside Ruth's kitchen window, the wind moved through the spruce trees along the fence line. Daniel watched the branches. He didn't leave immediately, Ruth continued. He stayed long enough that she thought he might stay entirely. But he didn't disagree with his family either, which is its own answer. He filed in the spring. She was 32. She sold what was hers and moved to Billings, then here. Ruth looked at him directly. "She doesn't talk about it. I'm telling you because I think you need to know, not because she would want me to. Those are two different things, and I've decided the first one matters more right now." Daniel thanked her for the tea and drove back to the farm in the long afternoon light, the fields catching the last of the sun and turning pale gold along the ridgeline. He drove slowly. He was thinking about the specific vocabulary that had been used. Not fit. Not a real woman. He had heard these phrases applied to equipment, to land, to soil that lacked some particular quality necessary for a specific purpose. The phrases were about utility, about what a thing could produce. They were not about what a thing was. The people who had applied them to Clara had not been saying anything true about her. They had been expressing something about themselves, about what they valued and what they were willing to discard when it did not produce what they wanted. He thought about the 6 years she had been carrying this, about the particular damage done by having people you trusted use language like that about you. Language that lodged somewhere you couldn't reach and colored the way you understood yourself, about the way she held herself at a careful distance from attachment, from anything that might require her to need something or be needed. He thought about the table always set for 4. He thought about how she was with Lily, the patience that was not performance, the attention that was not compensatory, but simply the natural expression of someone for whom caring for a child was something she was constitutionally suited to, regardless of what her body was or was not capable of. He thought about how Ethan, who did not warm to people easily or quickly, had begun in the past several weeks to direct occasional remarks at her in the dry, oblique way he had of indicating that someone had been admitted to his private category of people worth talking to. He drove home. He said nothing about any of it. He put it where it needed to go and let it settle. The school sent home a Mother's Day project the first week of March, weeks ahead of the actual date, in the efficient way of elementary teachers who prefer to get the difficult holidays organized early. Lily brought it home in her backpack without mentioning it at dinner, which was itself unusual, since Lily generally gave a detailed account of every school project within minutes of coming through the door. Daniel found out the following evening. He was in the living room when he heard Lily's footsteps on the stairs lighter than usual. Careful. She came through the doorway holding the card in both hands. It was made of heavy paper, folded in half, with a painted tulip on the front that was technically imprecise but clearly intentional. Lily had written something inside in her careful, still developing cursive. She went to Clara, who was in the kitchen finishing the last of the dinner dishes. She stood behind her and waited until Clara turned, and then she held out the card. "I made this for you," she said. Her voice was matter-of-fact, the tone of someone stating something that seemed to them obvious and not particularly requiring elaboration. Clara looked at the card. She looked at Lily's face, which was entirely open, no strategy, no performance, just the clear and uncomplicated certainty of a 6-year-old who has decided where her affection belongs and sees no reason to be coy about it. Something happened in Clara's expression that Daniel, watching from the doorway, could not precisely categorize. It was not a single thing. It was several things arriving at once, gratitude and grief, and something that looked like the sudden loss of whatever she had been using to hold herself together. She took the card with both hands. She held it with care, the way you hold something you do not want to damage. Then she said, very quietly, "You should give this to someone special, sweetheart." Lily blinked. Clara pressed her lips together. She looked down at the card for a moment, and Daniel could see that she was doing the thing she did when she needed to manage something that threatened to exceed management. The controlled breath, the steadying. She set the card carefully on the counter. "I need some air," she said. She said it to no one in particular, which was how you said things when you were about to leave a room because staying in it had become impossible. Lily turned to look at Daniel. Her expression was the expression of a child who has done what seemed to her obviously correct and has received a response she does not understand. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked. "No." He came over and crouched down to her level. "You didn't do anything wrong. You did something kind. That's not wrong." He smoothed the card on the counter. Sometimes kindness takes people by surprise, and when it does, they need a minute. That's all. Lily considered this with the seriousness she brought to information that required incorporating. Then she picked up the card and went upstairs to put it on her dresser, which was where she kept things she considered important. Daniel got Ethan to supervise the bath and went to find his coat. He drove into town in the rain. It was 9 in the evening, and the streets were quiet, the wet pavement reflecting the streetlights in long orange streaks. He had not called ahead. He was not sure, exactly, what he planned to say. He only knew that she was somewhere alone with something she should not have to be alone with, and that going to her seemed more important than having a plan. Her house was at the edge of town, a small rental on a street with mature cottonwoods. The lights were on inside. He parked and walked to the door and knocked. She opened it after a moment. She was still in her work clothes. Her eyes were not red the way they would have been after prolonged crying. She was not a person who cried easily or who allowed herself to, but they had a quality about them that he associated with a specific kind of interior effort, the look of someone who has been holding a weight at arm's length for a long time and whose arms are beginning to fail. "She still has the card," he said. She put it on her dresser, between her horse drawing and the photograph of her grandmother. Clara looked at him. "Can I come in?" She stepped back from the door. The house was small and very clean and had almost no personal objects in it, no photographs, no collected things, nothing that marked the space as belonging specifically to her rather than to whoever had lived there before. It was the house of someone who had decided not to become too comfortable in a place, who had learned through experience that comfort was a precondition for loss. They stood in the small living room. "I handled it badly," she said. Her voice was level. "She didn't do anything wrong." "I know she didn't. She stopped. "I know." She looked at him with the measuring look she had, the one that checked whether something was being said as a courtesy or as a fact. He held her look and did not add anything, and after a moment, she nodded slowly. "Ruth told you," she said. "Not an accusation." "Yes." She sat down on the arm of the sofa, not the seat, the arm, as though she was not committing to a longer stay in the conversation. She looked at her hands. He pulled the other chair around and sat, so they were at the same level, and waited. "When something like that happens to you," she said finally, "you learn what you're allowed to want. You revise the list. You take things off it." She turned her hands over, looking at them. "I had taken children off the list. Not being around them, I couldn't do that. It's not," she stopped. "But being their mother, being someone's mother, being the person who gets the card." She was quiet for a moment. "I had taken that off because it seemed better to take it off than to keep wanting it and keep losing it in different ways." He said nothing. He understood that she was not finished. "I shouldn't have let Lily get," she paused, revising. "I should have been clearer about what I was there to do. what I could and couldn't be. It wasn't fair to her. She doesn't think in terms of fair or not fair, he said. She thinks in terms of what she feels. And what she feels is that you're someone she loves. He paused. She's not wrong about that. Clara looked at him. Can I tell you something? He said. She waited. 3 years ago, when my wife left, the thing that was hardest wasn't the leaving. It was that I didn't know what my family was anymore. I had an idea of what it was supposed to look like, and it didn't look like that, and I couldn't figure out what to do with what was left. I kept waiting for it to resolve into something recognizable. He looked at the window, at the rain coming down the glass. It didn't. It just became what it was. And then you came, and it became something else again, and the thing it became was. He paused, finding the right word. Easier. Warmer. The kids are doing better. I'm not making mistakes from exhaustion. The house feels like a house that's being lived in rather than maintained. He looked at her directly. None of that is small. None of it is just housework. The rain tapped steadily against the window. The house was quiet around them. I'm not fit for any man, she said. She said it the way she had said it on the porch, not dramatically, but with a flatness that was the opposite of drama, a fact she had incorporated. Not the way it's supposed to go. I can't give you what a wife is supposed to. She stopped again. I can't give you more children. I can't give you a complete family. You deserve someone who can give you that. He let her finish. I already have a family, he said. I have 2 children who need someone consistent and present and paying attention. That's what I have, and that's what I'm working with. I'm not looking for a different family. I'm looking for, he chose the word carefully, for someone to be in this one. She was very still. You said something else, he said. Just now. You said you could love my children. She looked at him. Her hands had stopped moving. That's not nothing, he said. That's the whole thing. That's what Lily is telling you when she makes a card. That's what Ethan is telling you when he starts making remarks about the weather to you on Tuesday mornings. They're telling you that you're already in the family, that it's already happened. He paused. I'm just the last one to say it out loud. The rain kept coming. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, I know, he said. You already do. She looked at him for a long time. Something in her face changed, not dramatically, but perceptibly, the way a room changes when a window is opened. A shift in pressure, a different quality of air. I can't promise anything more than that, she said. I'm not asking for more than that. She nodded once. Slowly. Then she looked out at the rain, and he looked out at the rain. And they sat together in the quiet of her small house while the valley came down in water all around them. She called at 7 the next morning. He picked up on the second ring. Should I come in as usual? She asked. Yes, he said. She arrived at 7:30. He was at the kitchen table with his coffee when he heard her truck on the gravel. She came through the back door, hung up her coat, and set her thermos on the counter. She stood at the kitchen window for the usual 3 minutes, looking out at the fields, the east pasture, the line of fence along the creek, the sky which was clear and cold and very blue. Lily came down the stairs. She stopped in the middle of the kitchen when she saw Clara. You came back, she said. Clara looked at her. I always come back. It was the first time she had said something about her own continuity in this house as a simple fact, rather than as something that remained to be decided. Daniel noted this. He did not remark on it. Lily handed her the rabbit, apparently as a statement of some kind, or perhaps as a gift of safekeeping, and went to climb into her chair. Clara set the rabbit on the counter with care and poured her coffee and started on breakfast. Ethan came down, looked at the kitchen in its ordinary morning arrangement, said, "Eggs?" in the interrogative tone he used when checking whether the world was still operating normally, received a confirmatory nod, and sat down. He opened his book. Daniel sat at the table and let the morning proceed. He was aware of something having shifted, though it was a shift too quiet to name precisely. She moved through the kitchen with her usual efficiency, but something in the efficiency was different, not in the quality of the work, but in the quality of her presence in it. She was not performing a function. She was simply there, in the way that people are there when they have given themselves permission to be. He had seen her be careful in his house for months, careful not to claim too much, not to allow herself too much comfort, not to let herself settle too deeply into the space in case the space withdrew. The carefulness had been practical. A person who has been hurt in a particular way learns to protect the tender places, but it had also meant that some part of her had always been standing slightly outside the room, even when she was in it. That morning, she was inside the room. All of her. She hummed something under her breath while she cooked, very quietly, without seeming to know she was doing it. He recognized the melody. After a moment it was something from the classical station, a piece that had played on the kitchen radio the previous week. She had remembered it, and it had surfaced in her without her intending it to. This was, he thought, how belonging worked. It came in through the small doors when you were not watching, and by the time you noticed it, it was already inside. March came in cold and then, in the third week, relented. The temperature went up 15 degrees in 2 days. The snow that had been on the fields since November began to pull back from the darker soil along the ridgelines and creek banks, and the earth showed through in long dark patches, and the air smelled of mud and cold water and the particular mineral freshness that meant the land was thawing. The creek was audible from the house again, running high with snowmelt, and Walt, the border collie, started spending his mornings on the porch step in the thin March sun, having apparently decided that spring was worth making an effort for. The chair that had been against the wall was at the table now. It had arrived there over the course of several weeks, in the natural rearrangement of a kitchen with more people moving through it. No one had designated it or announced it. It was simply there, in its place, as if it had always been. Clara helped Ethan with his long division 2 evenings a week. She sat next to him and worked through the problems with him in a way that was neither tutoring nor hand-holding. She simply sat with the problem alongside him and asked questions that directed his attention without answering for him. When he got something wrong, she said, "Look at that step again," and waited. And he found it himself. He had stopped dreading math, which was not nothing. In fact, which was considerable. She braided Lily's hair on the mornings it needed it, which had become something Lily looked forward to with a formality that was charming. She would bring Clara the brush and sit very still and very straight in the chair, as though the braiding were a ceremony and she its willing subject. She had learned the farm's rhythms. The gate along the south fence that needed checking after hard rain, the window in the equipment barn, the particular sequence in which the morning chores needed to happen to avoid conflict with the tractor's temperamental cold start. She noted these things and addressed them. She had stopped being a housekeeper who was performing a contracted service and become, instead, someone who cared about how things went, which is a different thing entirely and produces different results. Daniel did not put a formal name to what had happened. He did not think a name was necessary, or that it was his to assign. What he understood was that the house felt inhabited again, in the deepest sense of the word, not just occupied, but lived in, by people who were there on purpose and intended to stay. One morning in late March, he came downstairs before the alarm. 5 o'clock, the sky just beginning to gray at the eastern edge. The kitchen light was already on. Clara was at the stove making the blueberry pancakes, because the first blueberries of the season had appeared at the market in town, and she had bought them without being asked, knowing. Lily was distributing napkins with the solemnity of someone managing an important task. Ethan stood at the counter cutting banana slices with the 7-inch chef's knife, handling it carefully, the way Daniel had shown him, fingers curled, blade rocking. 4 plates, 4 glasses, 4 chairs. He stood in the doorway and watched his family in the kitchen in the early morning light. He had stood in this same doorway on mornings when he could not tell whether the thing he had built here after everything fell apart was enough, or real, or something that would hold. He had stood here in the particular loneliness of a man who is loved by his children, but who cannot fill, by himself, all the space that a house contains. He thought about what his father had said to him once, in this same kitchen, when Daniel was 17 and asking about the farm's future. His father had been washing his hands at the sink and had not turned around when he answered. "It's not the land," he said. "Land is just land. It's what you build on it, what you tend. What decides to stay?" Clara turned and saw him in the doorway. "You're up early," she said. "Smelled the blueberries," he said. She turned back to the pan. The batter sizzled. Outside the kitchen window, the fields were beginning to show their first thin green at the margins, coming up through the retreating cold, tentative, early, entirely committed to the direction it was going. He went to the coffee pot. He poured a cup. He sat down at the table, at his place, and the morning began around him, in the way mornings had learned to begin in that house, with the ease of people who know what they are to each other, who have arrived at this knowledge through patience and through paying attention, and who have each, in their own time and in their own way, decided that what they have found is worth staying for. Outside, the valley was coming back to life. The creek ran loud and clear. The meadowlarks had returned to the upper field. The winter was almost done, and the house was full.